Dear friends, welcome to the second episode of the new video podcast series of RCS Cyprus titled Meet the Royal Commonwealth Society and the Commonwealth. In this episode, we will discuss the topic Commonwealth of Nations, past, present and future. The RCS network, although is not affiliated with the Organization of Commonwealth, promotes the similar values, ideas and principles in the Commonwealth countries. Therefore, it considers essential to understand the history of the Commonwealth, the development of the organization throughout the years, its current status, and its future prospects. In order to discuss this interesting issue, today we are hosting a very special guest, an expert in the field of Commonwealth studies, Professor Philip Murphy. Philip Murphy is a professor of British and Commonwealth history at the University of London and director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. His first book, Party Politics and Decolonization in 1995, was a study of the Conservative Party. He has also published a biography of the British colonial Secretariat and Lennox in 1999, the Central Africa volume of the series British Documents on the End of Empire in 2005, and a study of the relationship between the British royal family and the Commonwealth monarchy at the end of empire in 2013. His latest book, The Empire's New Clothes, The Myth of the Commonwealth, was published in April 2018. He is also a joint editor of the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History. Dear Professor Murphy, let me thank you again for accepting our invitation and welcome to the RCS video podcast series.
Thank you.
I'm sure that we're going to have a very productive discussion on this very interesting issue. Let me begin the discussion saying that the initial idea of the Commonwealth can be traced, of course, back to the British Empire in the late 19th century. We know that the modern Commonwealth passed from different historical phases in order to have this particular format. So my first question is, how did the Commonwealth come to take this current shape? And secondly, if you could give us some indicative landmark events in the Commonwealth history that change our understanding about the Commonwealth.
Well, thank you, Marinos. Yes. I mean, the interesting thing about the Commonwealth is that it doesn't start at a particular date in a particular way. It develops over time. And so last year, there was an attempt to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the founding of the modern Commonwealth with the London Declaration of 1949. But many people would say that the Commonwealth has a much longer history. The term is used from the 1880s onwards to talk about the self-governing so-called dominions. Initially Canada, Newfoundland as it was then, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa from 1910. And what you see is a gradual development of self-government within those territories, and also the beginnings of networks of communication and consultation. So Commonwealth Dominion prime ministers start to have regular meetings in London, and from the 1880s onwards, 1887, for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. And there are further meetings, into the 1930s, up to 1937, of Dominion prime ministers. And from 1944, towards the end of the Second World War, you have regular meetings of Commonwealth prime ministers. And that develops into the Commonwealth heads of government meetings that one sees today. So that's a very long history dating back to the 1880s. There's also a series of understandings about the nature of their relationship with each other and with Great Britain. So because in the early part of the 20th century, Britain valued the idea of maintaining its empire, it didn't like using the term independence for the status of its so-called dominions. But they have independence in all but name in terms of their self-government and increasingly their ability to operate a foreign policy. And that becomes recognized formally at the Imperial Conference in 1926, and it's enshrined in statute and the Statute of Westminster in 1931. And what the wording is that those territories are equal in status to each other. So they govern themselves, they have their own foreign policy, they, after the war, they join the United Nations as independent states, but they're bound together to the UK through the British monarchy. They retain the British monarch as their head of state, as their sovereign. So the next turning point, the next really major turning point is 1949.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1947, India and Pakistan achieved their independence. India wants to remain part of the Commonwealth, but as a republic. So the question is, can that link with the monarchy be broken? And it's not so much broken as transformed. So at the London Declaration in 1949, the other Commonwealth members recognize India's right to remain a Commonwealth member as a republic. And what they put in place is the idea of the British monarch as head of the Commonwealth. So not sovereign of India, but in some sense as the kind of uniting figure of the Commonwealth. So that's why 1949 is so important, and it's often represented as the birth of the modern Commonwealth. Because of that, but also because from that point on, when you have India joining, the majority of people in the Commonwealth belong to the developing world, so-called. Before that, you'd had these essentially European settler colonies. India changes the nature of that relationship. And into the 1960s, with rapid decolonization, wind of change, you see countries across East Asia, South Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, joining the Commonwealth. The next turning point is 1965, with the creation of the Commonwealth Secretariat, based in Marlborough House in London. So the first time you have a Commonwealth Secretary General to speak for the Commonwealth as a whole. Before then, it had been Britain that played a coordinating role and hosted most of the heads of government meetings. From 1965, the Commonwealth starts to look more like a conventional international organization with its own secretariat and its own representative.
Do you believe that the creation of the Secretariat, let's say, reduced the influence of UK in the Commonwealth?
It possibly does. And the other thing that happens is that 1969 is the last time that the heads meet regularly in London. After that, in 1971, they meet for the first time outside of London, apart from the two Ottawa conferences in the late 19th century and the 1930s. They meet for the first time outside London in Singapore. And after that, different Commonwealth states take it in turns to host Commonwealth heads of government meetings. So London is no longer the kind of the pivotal point of the Commonwealth in the same way, although to some extent it is, because Marlborough House, the Secretariat, is still based in London. So 65, you have the Secretariat, you have a development arm of the Commonwealth created in the early 70s, the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation. And the next, you could say, the next really major turning point, which is where the Commonwealth turns into really what it is today, is in the early 1990s. So the meeting of heads of government in Harare in 1991, they issue a declaration affirming member states' commitment to defending things like democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So you have a sense that the Commonwealth is an organization, but it's an organization which is united not so much by history, as by a common commitment to shared values. That's pretty much how we get to where we are today in terms of the Commonwealth.
Okay, thank you very much for this very comprehensive historical review. And again, it gave us an understanding how the Commonwealth developed throughout, the last decades. Now let's move to a second aspect of our discussion, related, of course, with the history of Commonwealth. If not the majority, a lot of British colonies were fighting in order to gain their independence from the British Empire, particularly in the decades on 50s and 60s. So my question is, why the majority of former British colonies choose to remain in the Commonwealth, given the fact that the UK had a much more influential role in the organization at that particular time? In other words, what were the incentives for the ex-colonies to join to the organization?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, clearly for the early members of the Commonwealth, countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, there's a very strong sense of being part of what historians have recently called a British world, that Australians would think of themselves as, in a way, part of Britain, as being British. And indeed, up until the 1980s, 1981, members of Commonwealth states were formally British subjects. There was this idea of a kind of a shared citizenship, but far more fundamental to that, a sense of cultural identity with the UK. Now, clearly, when you get to the 1940s and Indian independence, India and Pakistan have a very different relationship to Great Britain and a different sense of where they belong in the world. At the same time, however, think of some of the leaders of the new Commonwealth states, so-called, people like Nehru and Gandhi. Many of them had gone through British schools, British universities, through the Inns of Court in London. Some, their military would have been trained at Sandhurst. And they shared a kind of a Western style education. And when you talk to some of that, early generation of Commonwealth leaders, of post-Wind of Change Commonwealth leaders, they still identify, in a sense, with those cultural values at some level. And there was a sense that for India, the Commonwealth was another element of their place in the world. It was another network that they could use. And that was really how independence leaders in Africa, like Kwame Nkrumah and Kenneth Kaunda, looked at it. By the 1950s, 1960s, it had become very much kind of a campaigning, third world-based organization, lobbying very hard to end white minority rule in what was then Rhodesia and South Africa. And so it was seen as a kind of progressive organization which matched up with the values of those independence leaders. And again, that's partly why Cyprus decided to join after achieving independence in 1960, joins in 1961. It's important to recognize that this was not always the policy of the British government. The British government was anxious about breaking the link with the Crown over India in 1949, but saw it as worthwhile because India had been such an important part of the British Empire, and they wanted to maintain that link. the British were skeptical about whether newly independent African countries would fit into that Commonwealth club. Again, figures like Nkrumah wanted to join. They were skeptical about small states. What is the value of having small states in the Commonwealth? And yet Cyprus wanted to join. And indeed, you get to the 1990s, Mozambique, which had no links with the British Empire, was keen to join, to become part of that network, which it saw again as a way of buttressing its own stability, forging links with more powerful states in the world, some of which were major donor countries. And so the Commonwealth in 1995 allowed Mozambique to join, despite it not having those historical links, and despite the fact that the British government, as we now know from recent released documents, wasn't all that keen to have this innovation. Again, it was because of, if you like, consumer demand. Mm-hmm. And Rwanda, of course, another country without historical links to Britain, joins in 2009. And Rwanda has its own diplomatic reasons for wanting to do that, in a sense to break away slightly from the French sphere of influence in Africa. And, you know, for small and weak states, belonging to international organizations is a way of asserting their legitimacy on the world stage. And it's another platform in which to act internationally. So there were very few countries that had been part of the British Empire which didn't join the Commonwealth. Exceptions are those in which there was, in the case of Palestine, a violent struggle for independence in which the British were basically pushed out. Burma, again, where they lost control during the Second World War, never really properly regained control. And also, in the case of Burma, weren't prepared to allow Burma to join as a republic. They changed that rule in 1949. And then you have particular cases, again, the Irish Republic, Southern Ireland, when it decides to become a republic in 1948-49, leaves the Commonwealth. But in a sense, that's because, again, Ireland had had a violent independence struggle, had always felt that it had been included in the Commonwealth by force rather than by consent. And it was almost a natural development. South Africa, of course, leaves in 1961 because it knows that if it doesn't leave, it will be effectively kicked out because of its apartheid policy, which isn't acceptable to the newly independent African states, and only joins again after majority rule in 1995.
Do you believe that there were also economic, financial incentives, particularly for small states to join to the Commonwealth?
There is to a degree, although by the time you have the sort of so-called wind of change, the Commonwealth is losing any characteristics it had before as a kind of economic financial bloc. So tariff preferences are being reduced. The sterling area, so-called, comes to an end in the late 60s, early 70s. But the Commonwealth is an innovator when it comes to development. It argues for the position of small states, developing states in forums like the IMF and the World Bank. So again, for financial reasons and development reasons, it's seen as something which buttresses those countries' policies.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, if someone asks you, what were the main achievements of the Commonwealth over the last century, what could you say on that?
It changes over time again. So as we said before, in the early part of the century, particularly in the 1930s, it becomes an economic bloc protected by preferences. In the Second World War, it largely goes into war together, although again there are exceptions. The Southern Ireland remains neutral. South Africa very nearly doesn't join the war on the Allied side, but in the end does. So there's a sense coming out of the Second World War that it's still a significant military bloc, and even though that fades away somewhat, there are still very strong military and intelligence links, particularly amongst a sort of inner circle of older Commonwealth countries, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, which along with the United States forms the so-called Five Eyes of signals intelligence sharing to this day. The kind of the unifying purpose of the Commonwealth changes significantly from the 1960s, when you have an influx of members from the developing world, and particularly Africa. And at that point, the great struggle, the great issue becomes ending white minority rule in Southern Africa. And you could say that in a sense that holds the organization together. It's not always comfortable for Great Britain, because Great Britain is often under pressure to take stronger measures against initially Rhodesia and then South Africa. But it gives the organization a sense of purpose. And I think there is very much a sense that when South Africa does eventually move to majority rule in the 1990s, it's partly as a result of the Commonwealth keeping the issue in the spotlight. It's a far more complicated set of reasons why this system collapses, but the Commonwealth can claim a certain amount of credit for that. And again, the Commonwealth from the 1970s is an innovator in terms of how it thinks about development. With the CFTC, it spearheads so-called South-South cooperation. So it's not just the sort of Western donor countries giving out aid to the developing world. There's a sense of, well, what can developing countries learn from each other in terms of development? And as I said before, particularly in the 1980s, when the IMF, the World Bank, starts to impose very strict regimes on countries in the developing world, the Commonwealth is an organization which argues for their interests. And finally, I suppose you could say that within a kind of a Cold War context, it's very important because it keeps open links between different countries with very different sorts of regimes. So India in the 1960s, 1970s, into the 80s, has quite close relations with the Soviet Union, but maintains a very close relationship still with Britain and the other Commonwealth states. And the Commonwealth becomes an important bridge in that way.
I will totally agree with you that the Commonwealth was another platform and another link among the UK and the ex-colonies for cooperation and, let's say, to keep warm the relationship. Yeah. Now, talking about the present, what is the state of health today? Could you give us some indicative info about the organization? For example, the priorities of the Commonwealth, the main focus on topics, or the membership procedure, in order our audience to understand, the Commonwealth in the modern context.
Okay. On the one hand, it seems to be fairly healthy. There are 54 member states across the world. there are countries that still have expressed an interest in joining: Southern Sudan, Burundi. So it looks like it's a popular organization to belong to. Countries are not, on the whole, dropping out. And that's partly because, again, the idea of the Commonwealth being an organization of shared values, that those countries subscribe to democratic values, to human rights, to the rule of law. And notionally, at least, those values are policed by the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, which was established in 1995, which monitors the situation across the Commonwealth and will take action, supposedly, against countries that violate those principles. So it's a way of saying to the rest of the world, look, we belong to the Commonwealth, therefore, we're a respectable, progressive, humane regime, and you can trust us, you can invest in us. It's a sort of a mark of respectability in the international arena. You could also say in the Commonwealth's favour that it is adapting to the new global challenges. So it's taken an increasing interest in climate change, global warming, trying to organise a common position on those issues, on things like the pollution of the oceans, thinking about the global ecology. It's promoted women's issues, it promotes youth issues. So that's all, that's all very positive.
Mm-hmm. In terms of governance, which are the main bodies of the Commonwealth?
So the Secretariat is the coordinating body. So the Secretariat organizes heads of government meetings, it organizes ministerial meetings, regular meetings of finance ministers. So yeah, the Secretariat is a coordinating body. It has a Secretary General who currently supposedly serves for periods of 4 years and can be renewed once. There is a development arm, the CFTC, which we mentioned before. There is also a youth arm, which has its own budget. What is interesting about those three different elements, the Secretariat, the CFTC, and the youth arm, is that their funding has diminished very considerably over the last 5 or 6 years. It's gone down from about 50 million a year, which still isn't very much for a big international organization, to nearer 30 million. And that's partly because some of the bigger donors, particularly Canada, which ceased its funding of the development arm in 2013 because it was unhappy about the Commonwealth's attitude towards the regime in Sri Lanka. You can see that as a kind of a broader lack of confidence on the bigger donors, Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, in the Commonwealth and its governing bodies. And they don't in particular see the development arm as being particularly effective. Mm-hmm. And recently, in recent months, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK suspended payments, voluntary payments, to the development arm of the Commonwealth, really as a sign that they didn't have much confidence in the way the organization was being led. And You could say, well, okay, the Commonwealth has modernized in terms of taking up lots of pressing issues. On the other hand, it lacks a sort of a central signature issue in the way that South Africa, the struggle against apartheid was between the 1960s and the 1990s. It has a very small budget. It can't do very much, and yet it seems unable to focus on one particular issue where it can really make a difference. And there are and remain problems, particularly in the human rights area, which are peculiar to the Commonwealth because of its colonial legacy. So the criminalization of homosexuality is something that is peculiar to Islamic states and to a lot of Commonwealth states. And in the latter, because Commonwealth states, because they came out of the British Empire, had implemented British legislation criminalizing homosexuality. And that remains a sort of a big cultural problem across the Commonwealth. And it's something that the official Commonwealth has been cautious about, confronting head on.
I mean, your last comments about the problems of the Commonwealth and the challenges lead us to the last dimension of our today's discussion about the future of the Commonwealth. What are the prospects for its future? Can the Commonwealth survive as a significant international organization with this current status, with this current form? Let's not forget that many well-established and powerful international organizations with much more deep cooperation and commitment are facing many challenges. So what are the challenges for the future challenges for the Commonwealth, or the opportunities that may arise in the future?
I think that the Commonwealth will probably survive in some form. It's very important to remember that the Commonwealth isn't the Secretariat. The Commonwealth has existed for a long time before the Secretariat was created. And so that if the Secretariat disappeared, one would still refer to the Commonwealth as a group of nations, largely with a sort of a similar cultural heritage, a similar history. And there are a number of quite well-run and well-funded organizations, Commonwealth-wide organizations, the Association of Commonwealth Universities, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, for example, Commonwealth Local Government Association, which would keep going and still have a kind of coordinating role within their particular areas. Again, one wonders whether the Secretariat has reached a point when it is no longer particularly effective, and one might want to think about a looser association of Commonwealth states. And that would certainly be possible. Some people have suggested that Brexit in the UK will increase the importance of the Commonwealth. But it's difficult to see that will really happen. For Britain, the way in which British trade has developed over the last 50 years, about 45% of its trade is with the EU, less than 10% with the Commonwealth. It's very difficult to see that it could turn that around. And indeed, the Commonwealth hasn't had a kind of coordinating role in that way for decades now. And Britain, in a sense, has always struggled to make the Commonwealth work in its interests. You could say that it serves as sort of a soft power role for Britain in terms of keeping lines of communication open to a wide variety of different states and different parts of the world, and is in a way helps to promote British culture, British values. And yet the UK doesn't have a coordinating role. It's very reluctant to appear to be taking the lead in a Commonwealth sense because it doesn't want to be accused of playing a neo-colonial role. And indeed, you see the kind of the protests going on around the world over Black Lives Matter. And in the UK, they're very much focusing on symbols of and remnants of the British Empire. And that's a very sensitive point for Britain. And in a sense, the Commonwealth, for most people, serves as a reminder of the British Empire. And some people would say that it's an element of British imperial nostalgia, that it still exists and the Queen is still its head. So even if you think of the Commonwealth as a soft power tool for Great Britain, it's an ambivalent one. And, you know, perhaps British soft power across the world could be pursued more effectively without the existence of the Commonwealth.
Okay. Before we close, I think let's inform the public that the Royal Commonwealth Society Cyprus, in cooperation with the School of Law of the University of Nicosia and of course the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, are organizing a conference we titled Cyprus and the Commonwealth 1961-2021. The conference will be held on May 2021. Of course, more info you can find to the website and the social media accounts of the Royal Commonwealth Society Cyprus. Dear Professor Murphy, the stage is yours for your final remarks and comments.
Well, I think this will be a very interesting conference because, again, Cyprus joining the Commonwealth in 1961 was another significant turning point. It was the beginning of a Commonwealth of small states, if you like, and now the majority of Commonwealth states are small states. But before Cyprus joined, again, Britain was sceptical about the value of small states joining the Commonwealth. So it'd be really interesting to look at Cyprus in that context and see what Cyprus got out of the organization over subsequent decades. And I would just say also, if you're interested in learning more about some of the things that we talked about today, the Institute of Commonwealth Studies has its own Commonwealth Oral History Project archive with transcripts of interviews with dozens of different figures who played a significant role in the recent history of the Commonwealth. That's all available on our website free of charge. So please do have a look. It also contains some significant documents in the history of the development of the Commonwealth.
Thank you very much. Dear Professor Murphy, let me thank you once again for this really interesting discussion. I'm sure that the audience will enjoy the episode and will learn more about the Commonwealth of Nations. Dear friends, thank you for watching this episode, and please don't forget to subscribe on our YouTube channel, and see you to the next episode. Thank you very much.